are fought in the mind. He gave her the sword with which to fight in more ways than one. And she gave him her word, never to surrender. All she needed was a little help. A little hope.
This darkness is a disease, a rot that takes hold and spreads to every part of man.
At a Gamescom briefing in August 2014, Ninja Theory revealed Hellblade, an action-adventure game rooted in Celtic culture. The developers called it an independent AAA game, with the visual qualities representative of AAA games, but the creative freedoms of independent titles. An interesting tension for a game that was, at that point, leaning further toward the action sensibilities of the game, rather than the spiritual journey it would inevitably become. In researching for the game's narrative, director Tamim Antoniades stumbled across a specific term for how Celts viewed a particular mental disorder. Gelt, or a person who has been driven mad by a curse, grief, or the trauma of battle. And that Gelts would embark on a spiritual quest into the woods to purge themselves of their affliction. Antoniades, intrigued by this belief, positioned the main character of Hellblade as someone suffering with Gelt, only through our modern lens, grounded in real-life mental disabilities and a specific symptom: psychosis. Senua's sacrifice was born. In their mini-documentary feature, Ninja Theory discusses the process of researching mental health in order to properly display psychosis with a special regard for sensitivity. As Antoniades notes, there aren't many movies, let alone games, that feature this sort of stuff. They had to do it right. In order to accomplish this, the team reached out to Paul Fletcher, a psychiatrist and professor of health neuroscience at the University of Cambridge. In the video, Fletcher details the definition of psychosis and what patients with this symptom may experience.
Psychosis is a descriptive term, and it refers to having a loss of contact with objective reality. So it's characterized by two main sets of symptoms. One of them is hallucinations, where somebody experiences perceptions when there is no actual objective thing out there to perceive.
You're already dead. Who are you?
And the other is delusions, where somebody comes to very often bizarre, unpleasant, frightening beliefs when there's no good evidence in favor of them.
There's no doubt about it. The source of the darkness is in Helheim. And the goddess Hela holds his soul there.
It's important to note that while Ninja Theory goes to great lengths to portray the disability with the utmost sensitivity, these sorts of mental health problems are still largely taboo in a lot of cultures. In fact, some people who experience psychosis found the first Hellblade a bit troubling with its representation. Whether it be schizophrenia, psychosis, post-traumatic stress, bipolar disorder, personality disorders, or delusional disorders, they all have their own attached stigmas we've just begun to try and shake. In an article for The New Statesman, Professor Daniel Freeman notes his time when studying at Cambridge, and more specifically, how the psychology cohort didn't even discuss any issues of mental health, let alone psychosis. If issues of mental health weren't largely accepted in the program, then psychosis, as Freeman states, was the last taboo. Times are different now though, and Freeman, now at the University of Oxford, is working to leverage virtual reality as a therapy for those suffering with psychosis. And, more importantly, dismantling the stigma around various mental disorders throughout the spectrum. It's these discussions of stigmatization, however, that led me to perhaps the biggest realization surrounding psychosis, and how I read Senua. There are large societal misconceptions about all the psychiatric disabilities we discuss in this video, and indeed, how even I myself thought of psychosis when first engaging with the research. In fact, many mental health professionals don't even all agree on what fully constitutes the varying disorders. But one thing remained abundantly clear as I attempted to root myself amidst the sinews of academic discourse. Psychosis is not a diagnosis in and of itself, rather a symptom of a mental health disability. Senua may have these personal, rather intense encounters with her disability, but the guilt affliction is only part of the bigger picture. In other words, Senua doesn't have psychosis. She experiences psychosis. Heavily. Her true diagnosis emblematic of something larger. Yet, it's the traumatic moments before even the main events of the game that exacerbate her condition further than what we can even imagine. She suffers. Deeply. She shuffles in the dark, pleading for the light, for salvation. And it's our job to help her. That isn't to say there isn't any merit in specifically discussing the symptom of psychosis. After all, there's still so much to learn about it. And for the people that live with this experience, it can often be hell, with many frequently having to face alternate versions of reality through visual or auditory hallucinations. In this regard, Ninja Theory is still hard at work unraveling these stigmas ahead of Hellblade II with yet another nuanced mental health feature. And this brings us back to Senua. What can we make of her psychosis through her journeys? When Senua's hell is rooted in traumatic experiences, how do we mark sanitary restoration among her mental disability? Well, ahead of Hellblade II, now may be as good a time as any to parse out those trauma-ridden tendrils of Senua's mind.
Her story has already come to an end, but now it begins anew.
What's happening? It's breathing. The head. It's breathing. It's breathing. He knows she's getting closer. He can feel her coming closer. She's getting closer. They're watching. They're watching. They're watching.
Before we discuss Hellblade II, we have to briefly touch on Senua's emotional state throughout the story of Hellblade I. Perhaps the biggest affliction directly affecting Senua in the first Hellblade isn't actually her psychosis, but instead a form of trauma. Of course, the game begins with Senua on a spiritual journey to save the soul of her late beloved Dillion from the goddess Hela. But it's clear, even within the first couple of minutes, that Senua isn't fully capable of grieving. In fact, she isn't even ready to begin that process.
Just give him back.
German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche calls this affliction Ressentiment, or failed grieving, of the mind so unable to let go that from it spawns the hostility and resentment for the world and those around us. Life isn't fair, but it's been especially cruel to Senua, after all. We see the notion of ressentiment emanate through the black rot, an unknowable force that gradually takes over the body of Senua, at least supposedly the more she fails. Trauma literally eating away at her body and invading the mind. And it's this tension where Senua's disability comes back to rear its head the loudest. Senua's psychosis isn't caused precisely by her post-traumatic stress, but the inability to process her grief worsens her condition throughout the game. She isn't dealing with two separate issues, but instead, one big interrelated heartache. Trauma informs grief, grief informs her psychosis. Stuck in that maelstrom is an agony we can only fathom for Senua. The death of Senua's mother, Galena, only complicates things further. As a child, Senua watched her mother, the only role model and beacon of hope she had, die at the hands of her father. Galena was the only person Senua knew who suffered from psychosis, who didn't see the disability as an ailment. And she had to watch as she was tragically ripped from her life, burnt away, with Senua unable to shield herself from the screams and ashes of exoricide. In the end, Senua is able to accept Dillian's death. Only after sustained incidents of suffering, though, of course. In allowing herself to grieve for Dillian, however, Senua discovers she is also allowing herself to mourn a sense of self, a part of her identity that lived and died with Dillian. And it's this self-reflexive nature of grief and trauma that marks Senua's transformation for the end of Hellblade I and where Hellblade II begins. In trying to understand her psychosis and her place in the world with her disability, Senua found a sense of identity within her mother. And it was through Galena's murder that spawned yet another notion of unresolved trauma, a form of resentment that's festered from within and crept its way up throughout the game. Despite coming to terms with Dillian's death, Hellblade I ends with work still left to unpack, of Senua still needing to grieve a sense of self through the loss of her mother. Senua must still understand who she is, psychosis and all. Of course, it's not as simple as just mourning the untimely death of a loved one. No. Something this traumatic stems from something far deeper, just as sinister. Psychosis is not something to beat, but about adapting to how one manages living with it. The hardest battles are fought in the mind. That's what Dillian tells us, after all. In conquering one form of suppressed trauma, we find another still in need of remedying. And that's where Hellblade II picks up Senua's journey.
As he had. She carries him in her heart.
It begins as it ends.
His life will drive her on.
The past is never lost.
She will forge a purpose from his death. Make meaning from the pain.
Grief remains, twists, and
And then
contorts.
the Northmen came again to our land, stripping us of our names, our lives.
Senua's saga opens with Senua still hell-bent on reconciliation with the memories that marked her trauma before the events of the first game, with work still left to do, only now focused, resilient. But of course, psychosis plays its important role in how Senua works through her grief. Dillian is dead, yeah, but did her psychosis play a part in all the death that's encompassed Senua's life up to this point? And the voices, they always have their answers, don't they? There's an aura of interiority accompanying Senua in Hellblade II that feels different than the previous title, with her voices playing much more of a driving force. They still place fear, doubt, and anxiety in both Senua and us, just like in the first game. But there's also much more responsive dialogue happening beyond the scope of the screen in the quest for sanitary restoration, especially visually.
You thought they were real. Did you? You don't know. She never knows. Pathetic.
This time, Hellblade II is entirely letterboxed. Black bars filling the top and bottom of our screen. The intended effect is, of course, to produce a cinematic presentation out of the game, but it also carries deeper implications. Turning the subtitles on, you'll see various captions across the screen. Narration and dialogue happening within the borders, but the voices completely outside. They even fill the respective part of the screen based on where they're coming from through the binaural audio. Left, right, and center. Quickly, this creates a form of separation between the external world of NPCs, the super external of omniscient narration, and the internal of Senua's mind, with the latter continuously working for and against us. And it's how Senua comes to terms with her interiority through the events of the game that ultimately help her understand her unresolved grief from all those years ago. But trauma will always manifest itself in that which is the most personal, and those that hurt Senua the deepest. Even in New Land, Senua is still haunted by her shadow, reminding her that her affliction is ultimately responsible for all the grief she still holds on to. A past unwilling to let go. Grief is her darkness, and now in Midgard, Senua must work to uncover that darkness.
This is why you have come.
In the opening hour, the shadow whispers into Senua's ear that she'll never be free. That the supposed grief she thought she overcame in Hellblade I still follows her. She cannot leave her past, her mother and her Dillion, behind. Remarkably, however, there's truth to what the shadow tells Senua. Even the voices, easily impressionable by the shadow, twist his words into further torment and doubt. But it's Senua, still unwavering, who continues to pursue the light through the dark and unearth a better understanding of her past.
Go towards the light.
It is terrifying, but somehow
Let it draw you in.
beautiful.
In reality, grief is something that will always be with us. Acceptance isn't about moving on or letting go, but about understanding how residual love still permeates within us, even after loved ones are gone. And, more importantly, how our response to it shapes us. Grief isn't something to escape from, but something to learn to live with. In his own demented way, the shadow is right. We just have to peer through his deception of negativity. In this way, processing existing trauma is also coming to terms with how Senua lives, not just with her grief, but with her psychosis. Senua must understand that the stigma of her condition and how people react to it is not her fault. The voices are a part of her. They empower her, let her see more clearly, push her to be strong, and allow her to be brave. And sanitary restoration is also in tandem, soothing her heartache of feeling alone all those years without her mother and without her Dillion. As the recap at the beginning of the game notes, just as she did in Hellblade I, Senua will accept that the Furies are and will always be a part of herself. Only now, better equipped to understand the grief she'll always carry.
The Furies, as part of herself.
Of course, the sinews of Hellblade II are much more sinister the deeper you get into the story. Disentangling deep-rooted trauma takes time and tribulations I won't dare spoil for you in this video. The how it all happens is for you to explore with Senua. What's important is that you begin the journey and see it through. After all, to turn back is to lose oneself.
To lose yourself, lose your way, defeated and dead-eyed.
And we can never abandon overcoming trauma once we've begun that process, lest we lose ourselves to grief. Luckily, Senua is fiercer than ever, and will continue to refuse the gods, monsters, lies, deaths, doubt, voices, deceptions, and delusions that try and will try to prove otherwise. It ends as it begins. It begins as it ends. Let me know what you think of Hellblade. Do you think Senua's trauma is, in any capacity, resolved? And more importantly, does Ninja Theory express psychosis with sensitivity or in an interesting way? I'll be waiting for you down in the comments. I'm Christian. This is Save Room, and we'll see you in the next one.